Shadows don't always come from darkness. Sometimes they are born in the quiet corners of a life that once felt full. Freya learned this as her marriage to Phoenix turned from something warm and alive into something distant and mechanical. A routine stitched together by responsibilities rather than connection, where conversations were reduced to schedules and bills. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen stability, a well-kept home, children, a hard-working husband. But they would have missed the silence that filled the spaces between them, heavy and unmoving. Phoenix was never cruel, never unfaithful, but he was absent in a way that mattered more. Lost in endless workdays and late nights, leaving Freya alone at the dinner table more often than not. Her thoughts drifted back to the early years when he used to notice the small things about her, memories that now felt like echoes of someone else's life rather than her own. She stopped expecting anything different, convincing herself that this was simply what long marriages became. That love naturally faded into habit, that the ache she carried was something to be endured, until one ordinary morning when Phoenix rushed out the door with a hurried apology, barely meeting her eyes. A promise that no longer held weight, leaving her in the quiet kitchen with a sharper sense of emptiness, as if something inside her had finally grown tired of being ignored. It was that restlessness that led her to accept an invitation she might have declined before. A simple day out by the sea, casual and unremarkable, yet different enough to break the monotony. She didn't expect anything more than a distraction, a few hours of fresh air and polite conversation. But instead she met Daniel, a man who seemed ordinary at first glance, yet carried a kind of attentiveness that felt unfamiliar to her, the way he listened without interrupting. The way he noticed details others overlooked, like the hesitation in her voice or her drifting off mid-sentence. It unsettled her because it reminded her of something she hadn't realized she had lost, the feeling of being seen. Their conversations started innocently, woven around shared observations and small talk. But there was an ease to it that made time pass unnoticed. For the first time in years, Freya found herself laughing without forcing it, speaking without carefully measuring her words, allowing parts of herself she had quietly buried to surface again. When the day ended, she told herself it was just a pleasant coincidence, nothing more. Yet she couldn't ignore the subtle shift inside her, her thoughts returning to those moments with curiosity, as if her mind was trying to understand something her heart had already begun to recognize. The following days felt different, not because anything had outwardly changed, but because she carried a new awareness, a quiet realization that her loneliness was not as invisible as she thought, that someone else had noticed it without her having to explain. That knowledge lingered, both comforting and unsettling, creating a tension she couldn't easily dismiss, especially when she crossed paths with Daniel again at another gathering, their conversation resuming as naturally as if no time had passed, yet carrying an undercurrent. A subtle shift in tone and pauses, in the way their eyes met and held just a second longer than necessary. Moments that could still be explained away as coincidence but felt increasingly deliberate. Freya found herself caught between two versions of herself, one that recognized the danger in this growing connection and urged her to step back, and another that was drawn to the warmth of it, to the simple yet powerful feeling of being acknowledged. She didn't set out to cross any lines, didn't wake up one day deciding to change her life. But emotional shifts rarely announce themselves so clearly. They build quietly, layered through small interactions, until the line between what is acceptable and what is not begins to blur. For Freya, that realization came not in a dramatic moment but in a quiet one, sitting across from Daniel. She suddenly became aware of how much she was holding back, how many things she wanted to say but didn't, and how easily he seemed to understand even what remained unspoken. It was in that awareness that the weight of her situation became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about fleeting attention or harmless distraction. It was about something deeper, a connection rooted in the very emptiness she had tried to ignore for years. Acknowledging it meant confronting the reality of her marriage, the distance she had accepted, and the difficult truth that she was no longer as content as she had pretended to be. The conflict that followed wasn't loud or chaotic but internal and relentless. A constant negotiation between reason and emotion where every interaction with Daniel felt both meaningful and dangerous. And yet avoiding him didn't bring relief. only a sharper awareness of what was missing elsewhere. As days turned into weeks, the tension evolved into something more defined, a shared awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that there was something between them that went beyond casual acquaintance, something that required a choice, whether to step back or to step forward. That choice felt heavier than she expected, not because she didn't know what was right, but because doing what was right meant returning to a version of her life that felt increasingly hollow, while stepping into the unknown carried risks she couldn't fully measure. The moment that forced clarity didn't come through confession or confrontation, but through stillness. A pause in conversation where everything that had been building beneath the surface seemed to surface all at once. In that silence, Freya realized that the real conflict wasn't about Daniel at all. It was about herself, about what she had been denying, about the life she had been living on autopilot, and the realization that something needed to change in a way that acknowledged her own needs. That understanding brought with it a mix of fear and resolve, because change rarely comes without consequence. When she returned home that evening, the familiar environment felt different. She was seeing it with new clarity, noticing the patterns she had once accepted without question. The distance in Phoenix's presence, the routine conversations that lacked depth. For the first time, she didn't push those observations aside. She allowed herself to feel them fully, to recognize the gap between what her life was and what she needed it to be. Although she didn't have immediate answers, she knew that ignoring it was no longer an option. Whatever came next would require honesty, difficult conversations, and the courage to face outcomes she had long avoided. While Daniel had been the catalyst, the path forward was hers alone to decide. Shaped not by impulse or escape, but by a deeper understanding of herself and the life she wanted to reclaim. Even if it meant confronting truths she had spent years trying not to see,